My name is Samantha Mitchell, 34 years old, and I never thought I'd have to use my JAG training against my own family. As I stood in that courtroom, watching my stepmother Kathleen and her entitled children smirk at me from across the aisle, I clutched my father's sealed military file with trembling hands. Colonel James Mitchell deserved better than having his legacy torn apart by vultures. They thought they had won everything until I approached the bench. Before I share how I took down my greedy family in court, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button for more stories of justice served. Growing up as the daughter of Colonel James Mitchell meant understanding sacrifice from an early age. My mother died from cancer when I was only 8, leaving Dad to raise me alone on military bases across the country. Those early years were just the two of us against the world, him teaching me about honor, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Every night, he'd tuck me in with stories of his missions, the declassified ones, of course, and remind me that Mitchell women were made of steel. Everything changed when I turned 12. Dad met Kathleen at a military fundraiser in San Diego. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in his career. Within 6 months, they were married, and I suddenly had a stepmother who made it abundantly clear that I was an inconvenience to her new life. The birth of my half-siblings, Brett and Megan, only pushed me further into the background. "Sammy, give Kathleen time," Dad would say whenever I tried to explain how differently she treated me when he wasn't around. "She's adjusting too." But years passed, and nothing improved. Brett and Megan grew up with every advantage: private schools, expensive hobbies, lavish birthday parties, while Kathleen consistently forgot my academic achievements or extracurricular successes. Dad tried to compensate when he was home, but his deployments became my dreaded times, trapped in a house where I was treated like an unwelcome guest. When I announced my decision to follow in Dad's footsteps and join the military after college, Kathleen didn't bother hiding her disdain. "Of course you would choose that path," she said during a tense family dinner. "Some women are just not cut out for refinement." What hurt most was watching Brett and Megan absorb her attitude. My half-brother and half-sister, 15 and 13 at the time, began mimicking her dismissive behavior. Dad noticed, but seemed increasingly helpless to bridge the divide in his family. Still, my father beamed with pride at my commissioning ceremony. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered as he gave me my first salute. I saw Kathleen's eyes narrow at the mention of my mother, a woman whose photographs had mysteriously disappeared from the family home years earlier. After law school and joining the Judge Advocate General's Corps, my relationship with Dad strengthened despite the physical distance. We spoke weekly, and he confided in me about military matters he'd never discuss with his civilian family. Meanwhile, Brett dropped out of 3 colleges and Megan developed expensive tastes that Dad quietly worried about. Kathleen encouraged both behaviors while simultaneously criticizing my career choices. I was deployed in Germany when I received the call that changed everything. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack at home. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. At 58, Colonel James Mitchell, decorated war hero and the strongest man I'd ever known, was dead. The military arranged my emergency leave, but the 18-hour journey home felt like an eternity. I kept thinking about our last conversation, just 3 days earlier, when he'd seemed perfectly healthy and was talking about retirement plans. Something felt wrong, but grief clouded my judgment. The funeral was a blur of uniforms, flags, and the crack of the 21-gun salute. Throughout the ceremony, Kathleen played the devastated widow perfectly, while Brett and Megan seemed more annoyed by the military protocols than moved by them. I stood apart, both physically and emotionally, from the family that had never truly accepted me. 3 days after we laid Dad to rest, his longtime lawyer Harold Benson called us to his office for the reading of the will. I expected fairness from my father. It was his defining quality, after all. The will reflected exactly that. The family home would go to Kathleen, his military pension would continue to support her, and his personal savings would be divided equally among all 3 children. His military memorabilia, medals, and personal papers were specifically designated to come to me. I thought it was remarkably generous, considering Brett and Megan had received far more financial support throughout their lives than I ever had. But the moment Harold finished reading, Kathleen's facade cracked. "This is completely unacceptable," she snapped, her perfectly manicured nails tapping angrily on the conference table. "James promised me everything would go to me and my children." Harold looked genuinely confused. "Mrs. Mitchell, the Colonel was very specific about his wishes." "Then these aren't his real wishes," she insisted, glaring at me. "She obviously manipulated him during those private calls. This will need to be invalidated." Brett and Megan immediately backed their mother, with Brett adding, "Dad would never have wanted military junk to be more important than taking care of his real family." The real family comment stung, but not as much as what Kathleen said next as we left the office. "I'm contesting the will," she announced coldly. "James was not in his right mind near the end, and your influence over him was inappropriate. Prepare yourself, Samantha. When I'm done, you'll get nothing, not even your precious metals." The following week was a crash course in civilian legal proceedings. I might have been trained in military law, but probate court was outside my expertise. Fortunately, I wasn't without resources. Lucas Thompson, a former JAG officer who'd transitioned to civilian practice, agreed to meet me for coffee and advice. "So your stepmother is contesting the will," Lucas said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "On what grounds exactly?" "Undue influence, apparently," I replied. "She's claiming I manipulated my father because we spoke regularly." Lucas frowned. "That's a stretch, but with the right attorney, anything can become a legal nightmare." "Who's representing her?" The answer made him wince. "Mason Gardner from Thornfield and Associates, one of the most aggressive estate attorneys in the state." "He doesn't come cheap," Lucas noted. "Where is Kathleen getting that kind of money?" It was a good question. Dad had been comfortable on his colonel's salary, but not wealthy enough to afford Gardner's reported $800 per hour fee structure. "I need to know what I'm up against," I said. "Can you help me officially?" Lucas agreed, and our first task was to thoroughly review my father's will. As I suspected, it was meticulously fair. The family home was worth approximately $750,000, and Kathleen would receive my father's military pension of about $5,500 monthly for the rest of her life. His savings and investments, totaling just over $900,000, would be split equally between Brett, Megan, and me, giving each of us $300,000. The military memorabilia was priceless from a sentimental perspective, but had minimal financial value. "This is as balanced as it gets," Lucas confirmed. "The court will be hard-pressed to find any inequity here." But as we dug deeper into the family finances, troubling patterns emerged. Despite my father's generous provision, Kathleen had accumulated substantial debt over the past 5 years. Credit card statements showed regular withdrawals at casinos. Large transfers had been made to accounts we couldn't immediately trace. And most concerning, there were second mortgages on the family home that my father may not have known about. "Your stepmother has a gambling problem," Lucas concluded grimly. "And she needs more than her share of the inheritance to cover it." The first court appearance was set for 3 weeks after the will reading. I arrived early, dressed in a conservative suit rather than my uniform, wanting to appear as a grieving daughter rather than emphasize my military connection. Kathleen had other plans, arriving with Brett and Megan in coordinating navy blue outfits that subtly evoked military authority while painting them as the united, real family. Judge Evelyn Parker entered the courtroom with a brisk efficiency that immediately commanded respect. In her mid-60s with silver hair and piercing eyes, she had a reputation for cutting through emotional arguments to focus on legal facts. "I've reviewed the initial filings," she announced after the formalities. "Mrs. Mitchell, your claim of undue influence seems speculative at best. Colonel Mitchell's will appears properly executed and reasonably balanced." Mason Gardner rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Ms. Mitchell exploited her position as the Colonel's oldest child to isolate him from his wife and younger children. Their private conversations, which increased in frequency during the months before his death, coincided with changes to his estate planning. This was news to me. I turned to Lucas, who looked equally surprised. Your Honor, Lucas countered, this is the first we're hearing of any recent changes to Colonel Mitchell's will. The document we have has been in place for over 3 years. Gardner smiled thinly. Because Miss Mitchell has not provided full discovery of her communications with the Colonel. We have phone records showing calls lasting hours, often when Mrs. Mitchell was away from home. Judge Parker turned to me with a questioning look that made my stomach clench. Those calls had been about his concerns regarding Kathleen's spending and the children's future, but they were private. How could I explain without betraying my father's confidence? As the hearing progressed, Brett and Megan both testified about feeling pushed away from their father in his final years. Their stories painted me as a manipulative influence who played on military connections to monopolize our father's attention and affection. He wouldn't even discuss his retirement plans with us, Megan said tearfully. But he told Samantha everything. Their performance was convincing, but something felt off. Specific details they mentioned about conversations with Dad didn't align with his schedule or typical behavior. I made notes to investigate further. After the hearing, which ended with Judge Parker ordering a complete accounting of all estate documents and communications, I drove to my father's house, still technically Kathleen's house, to retrieve some personal items I'd left behind years ago. The locks had been changed. I was standing on the porch, contemplating my next move, when my father's old friend Walter Harris pulled into the driveway. A retired sergeant major who had served with Dad for decades, Walter had been conspicuously absent from the funeral and will reading. Your stepmother said you weren't welcome here, he explained gruffly. Been trying to reach you, though. We walked to a nearby park where Walter shared something troubling. Your dad came to see me about 3 months ago. He was worried, Samantha. Said if anything happened to him, I should tell you to look for a secure file. He seemed paranoid, not like himself. A secure file? Did he say what was in it? Walter shook his head. Just that it was insurance. I thought he was being dramatic, but now. As I drove back to my hotel, Walter's words echoed in my mind. That night, as I sorted through the few mementos I had from my father, I found a note tucked into an old birthday card. Sammy, remember our protocol for important documents. If there's ever trouble, the secure file has everything you need. Love, Dad. The military protocol. Of course. Dad had taught me years ago how he secured sensitive information. I knew exactly where to look. The next morning, I drove to the military base where my father had been stationed before his death. As an active service member myself, I had access, but I'd need to explain my presence in his former office. I fabricated a story about collecting personal effects for a memorial shadow box, not entirely untrue, but not my primary purpose either. At the administration building, I encountered unexpected resistance. The civilian secretary, Diane Powell, whom I'd known for years, was oddly formal. I'm sorry, Captain Mitchell, but Colonel Mitchell's office has been cleared out. Mrs. Mitchell collected his personal effects last week. This was surprising. All of them? What about his official files? Those were processed according to protocol, Diane replied, not meeting my eyes. I'm afraid there's nothing left. Something was wrong. Diane had always been friendly, almost motherly toward me. Now she seemed nervous, glancing repeatedly at her phone. As I was about to leave, a hand touched my elbow. Grace Foster, my father's longtime assistant, gestured for me to follow her into an empty conference room. Your stepmother has been here multiple times, Grace whispered once we were alone. She brought some colonel from personnel, Reynolds, I think, claiming she needed access to your father's secure files for insurance purposes. Did she get them? Grace shook her head. Not all of them. Your father had a separate secure server that required his biometric authentication or a military security clearance at your level or higher. I may have forgotten to mention that to Mrs. Mitchell. My heart raced. Is that server still intact? It was as of yesterday. I can give you 15 minutes in his old office. The security cameras loop during system updates, which happened to be scheduled for 1,300 hours today. At exactly 1:00 p.m., Grace led me through a back corridor to my father's former office. The room felt hollow, personal touches removed, but the government furniture remained. Grace pointed to a standard-issue filing cabinet. The terminal is behind the false back in the bottom drawer. You'll need your clearance code and his family access key. The family access key, a security measure Dad had created for emergency situations. When I was 16, he'd taught me about operational security by creating a family protocol with special passwords derived from significant dates and inside jokes. It had seemed like a game then. With Grace keeping watch, I located the hidden terminal and entered my credentials. The system recognized me, then prompted for the family key. I typed, Rusty 9 Pancake, a reference to our old dog Rusty and the Sunday pancake breakfasts that had been our tradition. The screen flashed green, and files appeared. Dozens of them, meticulously organized. I quickly connected my encrypted flash drive and began copying everything, my hands shaking with adrenaline. Most appeared to be standard military documents, but one folder labeled Kathleen Confidential caught my attention. With no time to review them there, I completed the download just as Grace signaled it was time to leave. We exited separately, with no one the wiser about our activities. Back in my hotel room, I began examining the files. What I found made my blood run cold. Dad had been investigating Kathleen for over a year. Bank statements showed she had been systematically siphoning money from their joint accounts to offshore holdings. There were photographs of her meeting with Mason Gardner, not as her attorney, but in intimate settings dating back 2 years before Dad's death. Most damning were the records of withdrawals from the Family Readiness Group accounts, a support fund for military families that Kathleen had volunteered to manage. As I dug deeper, I found medical records. Dad had been experiencing strange symptoms for months before his heart attack: dizziness, nausea, irregular heartbeats. He'd requested confidential toxicology screenings outside the base medical facility. The results were inconclusive, but showed unusual levels of compounds that could affect heart rhythm. Dad had compiled everything into a comprehensive file that he'd encrypted and sent to military police a week before his death. The final document was a formal request for investigation, never officially filed. The most shocking discovery came in an audio file, a recording of Kathleen on the phone with someone, her voice clearly recognizable. James is becoming suspicious. The doctor says his heart is already weakened. No, I can't wait any longer. Once everything is transferred to me, we'll have what we need. The kids? Brett and Megan won't ask questions as long as they get their share. Samantha is the only problem. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the computer. My father had suspected his wife was stealing from military families and possibly planning to harm him. He gathered evidence, but died before he could act on it. And now that same woman was trying to take everything he'd left behind. I needed to get this evidence to the authorities, but I had to be careful. If Kathleen suspected what I had, I could be in danger too. I made copies of everything, sending encrypted versions to Lucas and to my secure military email. Then I contacted Darren Reynolds, a cybersecurity specialist from my JAG unit, asking him to authenticate the files without explaining their contents. His confirmation came the next day: files are genuine, unaltered. Timestamps and digital signatures intact. Whatever this is, Sam, it's the real deal. With Darren's verification, I now had actionable evidence. But as I was preparing to contact the military police, I discovered something else in my father's files: detailed records of Kathleen's gambling debts and evidence of her affair with Mason Gardner going back years. There were even drafts of emails where Dad had confronted Gardner about professional ethics violations. The full picture was becoming clear. This wasn't just about inheritance. Kathleen and Gardner had been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to take control of my father's assets. And when he began to suspect, his death became convenient. The final piece fell into place when I located a sealed military police file attached to my father's records. It contained preliminary findings on the embezzlement from the Family Readiness Group, over $350,000 missing from accounts meant to help military spouses and children during deployments. The investigation had been quietly shelved after Dad's death, but the evidence remained. Armed with this information, I knew what I had to do. The next court date was in 3 days. It was time to end Kathleen's charade once and for all. I returned to my hotel room that evening to find the door slightly ajar. My military training kicked in immediately. I didn't enter, instead calling hotel security to accompany me. Inside, the room had been thoroughly searched. My clothes were strewn about, mattress appended, even the air vents unscrewed. Surprisingly, my laptop was still there, though I kept my flash drive with me at all times. This happen often in this hotel? I asked the security guard, who looked genuinely disturbed. Never on my watch, ma'am. We've got cameras in the hallways. I'll pull the footage right away. The cameras, conveniently, had malfunctioned for a 2-hour window that afternoon. The hotel apologized profusely, upgraded me to a suite on a different floor, and offered to call the police. I declined the police, but accepted the room change, not mentioning that I suspected this was no random break-in. That suspicion was confirmed at 2:17 a.m. when my phone rang from a blocked number. "You should stop digging, Captain Mitchell." The voice was electronically disguised. "Your father's heart gave out naturally. Tragic, but it happens. Keep pushing, and you might suffer a similar accident." "Who is this?" I demanded, already recording the call with an app. A friendly warning. "The file you found is incomplete. Using it will only hurt you and others who don't deserve it. Walk away with your share and everyone stays healthy." The call ended abruptly. I sat awake the rest of the night, adrenaline coursing through my system. Someone knew what I'd found and was desperate to keep it quiet. The threat only confirmed I was on the right track. The next morning, I took precautions, changing my routine, varying my routes, checking for surveillance. I was leaving the courthouse after filing additional discovery requests when Brett approached me in the parking garage. His usual arrogance was replaced with nervous energy. "You need to back off, Sam," he said, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Mom is really stressed about all this." "Stressed about what exactly?" "Dad's farewell or the money she stole from military families." His face paled. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do." "Did you know about the gambling, Brett? The embezzlement? Or how about her relationship with Gardner?" "You're making that up." But his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Is that why someone searched my hotel room and called to threaten me last night?" Brett's shock seemed genuine. "I don't know anything about that, I swear." "Then you're being used just like Dad was." "Think about it, Brett. Has Mom been acting normally since Dad died? Or even before?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like our father it momentarily softened my anger. "Just drop it, Samantha. Please. You don't know what Mom is capable of." That statement, more than anything else, confirmed my worst fears. The next court session was even more hostile. Mason Gardner launched a character assassination campaign, presenting affidavits from Kathleen's friends claiming I had been estranged from the family for years, returning only when money was at stake. He introduced military colleagues of my father who suggested I had used my position to access classified information improperly. Judge Parker's patience was clearly wearing thin with both sides. "Mr. Gardner, these allegations are tangential to the will's validity." "Captain Mitchell, these counter-allegations about Mrs. Mitchell's character are equally irrelevant without direct connection to the Colonel's estate planning." Meanwhile, Kathleen had taken her campaign public. Local military community newsletters featured stories about the ungrateful daughter, challenging her grieving stepmother. I received cold shoulders at the officers' club where I'd once been welcomed. Someone even created a social media page dedicated to exposing my supposed manipulation of my father. The pressure was getting to me. When I discovered that my father's medals and decorations had disappeared from the secure storage where I'd placed them, I broke down in my hotel room, sobbing with a mixture of grief and rage. These weren't just military honors, they were tangible connections to the man who had shaped my life, now being erased piece by piece. My lowest moment became a turning point when I received a call from General Frank Cooper, my father's commanding officer from his early career. "Samantha, I've been hearing disturbing things," his gruff voice announced without preamble. "Your father was one of the finest officers I ever served with. This circus around his death doesn't add up." "No, sir, it doesn't," I agreed, relieved to finally speak freely to someone who had known my father well. I kept my distance because Kathleen said you wanted privacy, but something felt off. Then I got a call warning me against helping you. That's when I knew I needed to reach out. General Cooper provided the crucial support I needed, connecting me with former military investigators who could expedite the review of my evidence. Through his network, we discovered something even more sinister, a discrepancy in my father's medical examiner's report that had been administratively buried. The official cause of death was natural causes, a heart attack consistent with his mild pre-existing condition. But the toxicology screen, which should have been routine, was mysteriously absent from the file. When Cooper's contact in the medical examiner's office quietly pulled the original data, it showed elevated levels of a compound that could trigger cardiac events in someone with my father's condition, a compound found in one of Kathleen's prescription medications. The day before the final court hearing, an unmarked envelope was delivered to my hotel. Inside was a USB drive containing security footage from my father's house on the day he died. The timestamp showed Kathleen removing a pill bottle from the medicine cabinet, crushing something into my father's coffee, then replacing the bottle in her own purse. The anonymous note with it read simply, "Your father helped my family when we had nothing. I can't come forward, but you should have this. Be careful." With this final piece of evidence, I was ready for court. But I also knew the risk had never been higher. Kathleen wasn't just fighting for money anymore. She was fighting to stay out of prison. The courtroom was packed for what everyone expected to be the final hearing. Local military families had turned out, curious about the increasingly public battle over Colonel Mitchell's estate. Kathleen arrived looking confident in an expensive black suit, flanked by Brett and Megan, both dressed solemnly. Mason Gardner carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than a month of my military salary. I sat alone at my table. Lucas had been called away on a family emergency, too conveniently timed to be coincidence. I suspected Kathleen's influence had somehow manufactured his absence, leaving me to face this crucial hearing without counsel. Judge Parker noticed immediately. "Captain Mitchell, where is your attorney?" "Family emergency, Your Honor." "I'm prepared to proceed representing myself." Gardner smirked. "Your Honor, given the complexity of today's hearing, perhaps a continuance would be appropriate to allow Captain Mitchell to secure new counsel." It was a calculated move, appearing generous while forcing more delays that would drain my resources and resolve. But I couldn't afford to wait. "I appreciate opposing counsel's concern," I replied evenly, "but as a JAG officer, I'm qualified to proceed. Any delay only prolongs the mishandling of my father's estate." Judge Parker studied me carefully, then nodded. "Very well. We'll proceed. Mr. Gardner, your final arguments regarding the will's validity." Gardner was masterful, weaving a compelling narrative of a manipulative daughter who had poisoned her father against his real family, leading to an unfair distribution that failed to recognize Kathleen's years of devoted marriage and the needs of her children. Brett and Megan both testified again, their stories rehearsed to perfection about how I had systematically isolated our father and turned him against them. Colonel Mitchell was not in his right mind when he created this will, Gardner concluded. The evidence clearly shows undue influence from Captain Mitchell, who exploited her military connection with her father to override his natural inclination to provide primarily for his wife and dependent children. Throughout his presentation, Kathleen dabbed at tears with a monogrammed handkerchief, the perfect image of a grieving widow. Brett and Megan flanked her protectively, a united family against the outsider, me. When my turn came, I approached the podium calmly. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has painted a dramatic picture, but it's fiction. The will we're discussing wasn't created in the weeks before my father's death. It was established 3 years ago and never modified. There was no last-minute change, no deathbed manipulation." I presented the documentation showing the will's history, then continued. Colonel Mitchell was of sound mind and body when he created a fair distribution that acknowledged both his current wife and all his children equally. The military memorabilia he left to me has sentimental rather than financial value and represents the heritage we shared as service members. Judge Parker interrupted. Captain Mitchell, while I appreciate your argument, Mr. Gardner has presented witness testimonies suggesting your undue influence over your father's decisions. Do you have evidence to counter these specific allegations? This was the moment everything hinged on. I took a deep breath. Yes, Your Honor. I had hoped to avoid this, but I can no longer allow my father's memory and last wishes to be distorted. I removed a sealed folder from my briefcase. This contains evidence that the contest of this will is not just unwarranted, but potentially criminal in nature. Gardner was on his feet instantly. Objection. This is grandstanding, Your Honor. Any evidence should have been disclosed during discovery. This evidence was not in my possession during discovery, Mr. Gardner. It was secured in my father's military files and only recently obtained through proper channels. That wasn't entirely accurate, but it was close enough to the truth. Judge Parker held out her hand. I'll review it and determine its relevance. Your Honor, I added, given the nature of this evidence, I've also taken the liberty of forwarding it to the appropriate authorities. They should be arriving momentarily. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened and Captain Rachel Anderson of the military police entered, accompanied by 4 uniformed officers. They stood at attention at the back of the courtroom. Judge Parker's eyebrows rose as she opened the file and began reviewing its contents. Her expression shifted from skepticism to shock, then to something harder as she turned the pages. Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Mitchell, she said finally, I believe we need to take a recess while I review this material fully. Your Honor, Gardner protested, whatever Captain Mitchell has presented is clearly a desperate attempt to. Mr. Gardner, Judge Parker cut him off sharply, you'll want to review this before continuing that sentence. She handed him several pages from the file. As Gardner read, the color drained from his face. He glanced at Kathleen, who was watching him with growing alarm. When he tried to slide the papers to her, Judge Parker stopped him. Those don't leave your hands, Counselor. The room fell silent as the judge continued reading. Brett leaned over to whisper something to Kathleen, who shook her head sharply. Megan looked confused, her eyes darting between her mother and me. Finally, Judge Parker looked up and nodded to Captain Anderson, who approached the bench. After a brief, hushed conversation, the judge addressed the courtroom. In light of evidence suggesting criminal activity related to this case, this hearing is temporarily suspended. Captain Anderson has matters to address before we proceed. Captain Anderson stepped forward, her posture military straight. Kathleen Mitchell, I'm placing you under investigative custody regarding allegations of embezzlement from the Family Readiness Group funds, fraud, and tampering with evidence in a military investigation. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Kathleen's face contorted with rage as she turned to me. You vindictive little. Mrs. Mitchell, Captain Anderson interrupted. I advise you to remain silent until you've consulted with counsel. Mr. Gardner, as you are implicated in several of these documents, you may wish to recuse yourself at this time. Gardner was already backing toward the door, briefcase clutched to his chest, when another military police officer stepped into his path. Mason Gardner, we also have questions regarding your involvement in the misappropriation of military family support funds and potential ethics violations related to your relationship with Mrs. Mitchell prior to Colonel Mitchell's death. Brett and Megan sat frozen, watching their mother's carefully constructed world collapse. I felt no joy, only a hollow vindication that the truth was finally emerging. Captain Rachel Anderson stood at parade rest in front of Judge Parker's bench, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned courtroom. Your Honor, the military police have been investigating discrepancies in the Family Readiness Group accounts for the past 8 months. Colonel Mitchell initially brought these concerns to our attention before his death, but the investigation was temporarily suspended during the change in command. She gestured to the file that Judge Parker had been reviewing. The documents provided by Captain Mitchell corroborate our findings and add substantial evidence of additional crimes. As if on cue, 2 more military police officers entered, carrying evidence boxes. Mrs. Kathleen Mitchell is being detained on suspicion of embezzling approximately $352,000 from funds designated to support military families during deployments. As treasurer of the Family Readiness Group, she had access to accounts that were systematically depleted over a 3-year period. Kathleen, who had recovered from her initial shock, attempted to stand. "This is ridiculous. I've dedicated my life to military families. This is clearly Samantha's revenge for..." "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Parker interrupted sharply, "I suggest you exercise your right to remain silent. These allegations extend beyond this courtroom and my jurisdiction." Captain Anderson continued methodically. Additional charges include fraud related to second mortgages obtained on Colonel Mitchell's property without his knowledge, using forged signatures, and evidence tampering related to financial records that were altered after Colonel Mitchell began his own inquiry. Mason Gardner, seeing his client's position deteriorating by the second, attempted to distance himself. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of any criminal activities. I was retained solely for the purpose of contesting the will based on information Mrs. Mitchell provided to me." Captain Anderson turned her attention to him. "Mr. Gardner, we have documentation of your participation in establishing offshore accounts where embezzled funds were transferred. We also have evidence of your personal relationship with Mrs. Mitchell dating back approximately 26 months, during which time you continued to represent Colonel Mitchell in legal matters, creating a significant conflict of interest." Gardner made a sudden move toward the courtroom doors, but military police officers blocked his exit. "This is outside military jurisdiction. You have no authority to detain me." "The FBI has entered the investigation due to the wire fraud aspects," Captain Anderson replied calmly. "Their agents are waiting to speak with you outside." As Gardner was escorted from the courtroom, a medical examiner I recognized from the base approached the bench and handed Judge Parker another file. "Your Honor," Captain Anderson explained, "this is Dr. Lawrence Hirano, Chief Medical Examiner from Fort Carson. He has findings relevant to these proceedings." Dr. Hirano cleared his throat. "Judge Parker, at the request of military investigators, I conducted a secondary analysis of Colonel Mitchell's tissue samples preserved after his autopsy. We found significant levels of thioprophenic compound, which can trigger cardiac events in patients with Colonel Mitchell's specific heart condition. This compound is not available in the United States, but is present in prescription medication that Mrs. Mitchell obtained during a trip to Mexico 3 months before the Colonel's death." The courtroom fell completely silent. Brett's face had gone ashen, and Megan began to cry quietly. Judge Parker, visibly disturbed, addressed the room. "In light of these serious criminal allegations, this probate matter is no longer the priority. I am ruling immediately on the validity of Colonel Mitchell's will, finding it to be legal and binding as written. Captain Mitchell's share of the estate shall be released immediately. Mrs. Mitchell's portion will be held in escrow pending the outcome of criminal proceedings." She turned to Brett and Megan. "As the other named beneficiaries are not implicated in any wrongdoing, their portions will be distributed according to the will's terms." Kathleen, now flanked by military police officers, looked desperately toward her children. "Brett, Megan, tell them this is a mistake. Samantha has manipulated everything, just like she manipulated James." Brett wouldn't meet her eyes, but Megan stood shakily. "Mom, did you hurt Dad?" The raw pain in my half-sister's voice cut through the formal proceedings. For the first time, I saw her not as Kathleen's daughter, but as another victim who had lost her father. Kathleen's composure finally broke entirely. "He was going to ruin everything. He found the accounts. He was going to report me." "What about your university, Megan? Your career plans, Brett? He was going to leave us with nothing because of her." She jabbed a finger toward me. Her confession, witnessed by a courtroom full of people including a judge, military police, and court reporters, echoed in the stunned silence. Captain Anderson nodded to her officers, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Kathleen Mitchell, you are under arrest for the embezzlement of military family funds, wire fraud, and in light of your statement, the death of Colonel James Mitchell. You have the right to remain silent." As Kathleen was led away, still shouting accusations at me, Mason Gardner crumbled under FBI questioning in the hallway outside. Faced with evidence of his complicity in the financial crimes and learning of the potential murder charge against Kathleen, he quickly turned on her, offering to provide evidence in exchange for leniency. Judge Parker called me to the bench after the courtroom had partially cleared. "Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology for not seeing through this sooner. Your father was clearly a man of integrity who raised a daughter with the same quality." "Thank you, Your Honor. I only wanted to honor his wishes. And in doing so, you've uncovered crimes that impacted many military families. That speaks to the kind of officer you are." She hesitated, then added more personally, "Your father would be proud." As I gathered my things to leave, "We thought you were trying to take everything," Megan added, her voice small. "Mom told us Dad changed before he died, that you were poisoning him against us." I looked at my half-siblings, really looked at them, and saw confusion, betrayal, and grief that mirrored my own. She manipulated all of us in different ways. "What happens now?" Brett asked. "Now," I said, feeling the weight of responsibility my father must have carried, "we try to honor Dad's actual wishes. He wanted us to be a family, even if we never quite managed it while he was alive." The weeks following the courtroom revelation were a blur of legal proceedings, media coverage, and painful adjustments. Kathleen remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk after investigators discovered her packed suitcase and one-way ticket to a non-extradition country. Mason Gardner struck a plea deal, providing evidence against Kathleen in exchange for reduced charges. The military community, initially divided by Kathleen's smear campaign against me, rallied around the truth. The stolen family readiness group funds had affected dozens of military families during deployments, money meant for emergency childcare, home repairs, and medical expenses that weren't covered by military insurance. 3 weeks after the arrest, I finally received my father's military memorabilia. His medals, photographs, and service records were delivered by Captain Anderson herself. "We found these in a storage unit rented under Mason Gardner's name," she explained as I carefully opened the box. "Mrs. Mitchell apparently couldn't bring herself to destroy them, but wanted them hidden from you." Holding my father's Silver Star and Legion of Merit medals, I felt a connection to him that transcended death. These weren't just decorations, they were tangible proof of his courage, sacrifice, and the values he'd lived by. My relationship with Brett and Megan evolved hesitantly. A week after the courthouse drama, Brett requested a meeting at a neutral coffee shop. "I need you to know," he said after we'd settled with our drinks, "that I had suspicions about Mom's behavior, but I was too afraid to act on them. The way she controlled everything, it wasn't normal, but it was all I knew." "Why didn't you ever reach out to Dad? Or to me?" I asked. Brett stared into his coffee. "She convinced us that Dad only tolerated us because of her, that his real loyalty was to you and the military. Anytime we questioned her version of things, she'd threaten to cut us off. No college, no allowance, no home." "Financial abuse," I said quietly. "I guess so. I never thought of it that way." He looked up finally. "Did Dad ever talk about us?" "Really?" The vulnerability in my 30-year-old half-brother's face struck me. "All the time, Brett. He kept every report card, every sports trophy photo. He talked about your potential, how smart you were when you applied yourself. He never gave up hope that you'd find your path." Brett's eyes filled with tears. I wasted so much time believing her lies. That conversation began a slow healing process. Megan joined our next meeting, initially hostile but gradually opening up as we shared stories about our father from our different perspectives. As the criminal case proceeded, we learned the full extent of Kathleen's deception. The prosecution's evidence included the video footage of her tampering with my father's medication, financial records showing systematic theft, and her own incriminating statements. Facing overwhelming evidence, she eventually accepted a plea deal, 30 years for involuntary manslaughter, fraud, and embezzlement. With the legal matters settled, I proposed using the recovered embezzlement funds to establish the Colonel James Mitchell Military Family Support Foundation. Brett and Megan enthusiastically joined the project, each finding ways to contribute. Brett's business degree, previously unused, proved valuable in setting up the organizational structure, while Megan's social media expertise helped us reach military families in need. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation, we held a proper memorial service for our father at Fort Carson, free from Kathleen's controlling influence. Hundreds of military personnel, from generals to privates who had served under him, attended to pay their respects. General Cooper delivered a moving eulogy that captured my father's dedication to both his country and his family. James Mitchell believed in duty, honor, and integrity, he concluded. But he also believed in redemption and second chances. The foundation his children have established in his name embodies those values and ensures his legacy continues. After the ceremony, Colonel Harris, another of my father's old friends, approached me with a sealed envelope. "Your father asked me to give you this if anything happened to him." With everything that was going on, it took me a while to find the right moment. Alone that evening, I opened the letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Samantha **. If you're reading this, I'm gone, likely before I could finish what I started. I've discovered things about Kathleen that have shaken me to my core. The woman I married is not who I thought she was. I've gathered evidence and am preparing to confront her, but if something happens to me, you'll need what I've collected, **. I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you. You've embodied every value I tried to instill: honor, courage, integrity, and become an extraordinary woman and officer. Your mother would be as proud as I am, **. Brett and Megan are victims in this too, manipulated by their mother in ways they may not even recognize. If possible, help them see the truth and find their own paths, **. I love you, Sammy. You were always my true north, my reminder of why integrity matters. Whatever happens, stand tall and remember who you are, a Mitchell, through and through, **. Love always, Dad **. The letter brought both tears and peace. My father had known the truth and had been preparing to act. In completing what he started, I'd honored him in the most meaningful way possible. The final chapter of healing came unexpectedly during a military ceremony where I was receiving a commendation for my role in exposing the embezzlement scheme. As I stood at attention while the citation was read, I felt a presence beside me. Brett and Megan had come to support me, both dressed respectfully and standing tall. Afterward, Megan hugged me awkwardly. "I found some old photos of you and Dad that Mom had hidden away. I thought maybe we could look at them together sometime." That evening, the three of us sat in my apartment, sorting through photographs that chronicled a shared history we'd experienced separately. There was Dad teaching me to fish when I was 7. Dad at Brett's Little League games. Dad beaming at Megan's dance recital. Different moments with the same proud father. "He wanted us to be a real family," Brett said quietly, studying a rare photo of all 5 of us at his high school graduation, one of the few times we'd presented a united front. "Maybe it's not too late." As I pinned my father's Lieutenant Colonel Oak leaves to my uniform the following week, accepting the promotion he'd never see, I felt his presence and approval. I had not only preserved his legacy and brought justice for his death, but had also begun building the family connections he had always wanted for his children. The journey had been painful, but the truth had ultimately set us all free from Kathleen's manipulation, free from the weight of suspicion, and free to honor our father's memory by living according to the values he had embodied. Have you ever had to stand up for the truth when everyone around you is telling a different story? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more real-life stories of overcoming adversity. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement to stand firm in their integrity, even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting.